On that morning, filled with soft light, the building of one of the most prestigious universities abroad was enveloped in silence and concentration. In a spacious lecture hall, majestic and impressive, sat students from various countries. Among their peers, diligently working in silence, their faces were illuminated by the light from laptops, and books lay open before them on wooden desks. At the podium stood Professor Victoria Wilson, a woman about whom many legends circulated in academic circles. She was 56 years old, and her imposing stature, along with her graying hair, gave her the appearance of someone who had seen much on her scholarly journey. Her strict, neatly pressed black suit exuded an aura of authority and confidence. Victoria Wilson was known for her sharp mind and critical thinking skills. Her scholarly interests lay in the fields of philosophy and natural science. She was one of those rare lecturers whose lessons were remembered for many years. Professor Wilson was also known for openly adhering to atheist views, considering religion to be nothing more than a social construct limiting rational thought. Religion is a crutch for those who fear the unknown, she once said while speaking to a full house of scholars at a global conference. Her speeches were imbued with a challenge to logical thinking and the ability to question any beliefs lacking solid foundations. Among the student body stood out Irina Prokopenko. The 18-year-old girl radiated calmness and confidence. Her personality combined sensitivity and strength, which instantly attracted the surrounding gazes. Unlike some of her peers, Irina wore a delicate cross around her neck that sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the high windows of the auditorium. She was a deeply religious person, a Christian to the core, who studied the Bible seriously. Her family, from which she came, was known for their devotion to Christian traditions. On that blessed day, a class on philosophy and natural science was scheduled. Professor Wilson confidently approached the board and, taking a marker in her hand, wrote in large white letters a carefully thought-out question. Does God really exist? This was a question that would provoke debate and discussion every time. A question that touched not only theory, but also the very depths of each attendee's heart. A whisper immediately went through the auditorium. Students began conversing, exchanging glances. For some, this topic was interesting. For others, it was too heavy. Professor Wilson smiled slightly, observing their reaction. Today, we will discuss one of the most fundamental questions that has been debated by people for centuries, she said in a quiet but surprisingly clear voice. Is God a reality, or is it a product of our imagination? She glanced around the hall and paused, allowing her words to reach every corner of the auditorium. I am sure, she continued, that many of you hold different views on this question. But do you really have logical justifications for your faith? Or is it conditioned only by your upbringing and traditions? A few students in the auditorium nodded, agreeing with her words, while doubt was evident on the faces of others. Professor Wilson took a few steps towards the center of the auditorium, her strict gaze seeking the students' reactions. Who among you can muster the courage to explain to me, using scientific arguments, why you believe in God? Her voice carried a challenge. And even silence hung over the auditorium. The students froze, feeling the weight of the question posed, also knowing that the professor's responses could be just as demanding. They had witnessed her mastery in debate and understood that their arguments needed to be impeccably logical. Despite this, Irina Prokopenko gradually raised her hand in the middle row. Her confident movement stirred the silence, and the attention of the entire auditorium was now focused on her. Professor Wilson fixed her gaze on Irina, and her slightly sarcastic smile lit up her disarming expression. "It seems we have a daredevil," she said with a hint of surprise. "Please introduce yourself." Irina stood up, her posture confident and graceful. "My name is Irina Prokopenko," she said in a soft but firm voice. Her face radiated calmness, but her eyes showed an indomitable spirit. "I believe in God not only because of my faith, but also because science and logic lead to Him." A weary silence arose in the auditorium as the attention of all present turned to Irina. Professor Wilson crossed her arms, studying the young woman before her with a mix of respect and amazement. "Well, Irina," she said, "give me one scientific reason proving the existence of God." Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and anticipation. Irina did not turn pale. On the contrary, she took a deep breath, allowing herself a slight, encouraging smile. She understood that this moment would be an unusual discussion, a moment when her faith and logic would be tested before an audience shaped by rationality and skepticism. The students listened attentively, with some leaning slightly forward in their seats, while others quietly hoped that Irina could offer a truly convincing argument. Professor Wilson, raising an eyebrow slightly, was intrigued. "Well, Irina," she invited in a doubtful tone, "give me one scientific reason that proves the existence of God. And remember, I expect something logical." Irina maintained her composure and began to speak. "Professor, before I answer your question, may I ask you one?" Victoria Wilson listened to her request with slight surprise before granting permission. The outcome of this discussion depended on her answer. Irina leaned forward slightly, focusing all her attention on the professor. "Do you agree that the complex and orderly requires a creator?" Irina's words were clear and confident. The professor pondered for a moment before responding automatically. "Yes, I agree. Complex things usually have an explainable origin in science." Irina nodded. "Excellent. If we find a watch with a complex and perfectly synchronized mechanism, we should conclude that it was created, shouldn't we?" Professor Wilson responded without hesitation. "Of course, that would be a logical conclusion." Irina smiled slightly, assuring that her argument was receiving validation. "If that is the case, what about the universe? The universe is far more complex and orderly than a simple watch. Do you really believe it is possible that such an astonishing structure could have arisen on its own, without the participation of a creator?" Silence fell over the auditorium again. Some students exchanged glances, while others, intrigued for the first time in the discussion, began to listen attentively. Professor Wilson smirked slightly before responding. "Your argument is interesting, Irina," she said, still maintaining a light smile on her lips. "But it is too simplified. Science has already proven that the universe originated from the Big Bang, not from a creator." Irina smiled. "All right, Professor. I will use your logic. Since we are discussing the Big Bang, could you please tell me what was its initial cause?" Professor Victoria shortened the distance between herself and the students before responding. "According to scientific theory, the Big Bang occurred from a small, extremely dense singularity that then exploded and began expanding, forming the universe as we know it." Irina slowly nodded, contemplating her words. "So, Professor, are you suggesting that something can arise from nothing?" Professor Wilson hesitated for a moment, knowing that such a question is difficult to explain from a scientific standpoint. The law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. A quiet whisper spread through the auditorium as students began to share their thoughts on the matter. Then, one student raised his hand, drawing Victoria's attention. "Professor," he began cautiously, "doesn't Irina's question make sense? If everything needs a cause, why then could the universe arise without a cause?" Professor Victoria paused for a moment, contemplating his question, and then replied, "This is a question often raised in philosophy," she said. "But science does not rely on the hypothesis of God to explain." Irina quietly smiled, her gaze radiating confidence. "Professor, I understand that science strives to explain everything without God's involvement, but doesn't it thereby impose its limitations? If we cannot explain something, does that mean it does not exist?" Professor Wilson was not one to easily concede in an argument. She would never abandon her opinion due to one discussion. But she had to admit that Irina's discussion was interesting. "All right, Irina. Let's assume for the sake of argument that the universe indeed has a designer. But why are you so convinced that this designer is the God you believe in?" Irina took a deep breath, preparing to respond. She had to defend her beliefs before an audience ready to question everything. "Professor, the laws of nature are part of that structure I just mentioned. The laws of nature cannot affect their own existence. There must be something that established them initially." From the depths of the auditorium, the voice of another student was heard, who, in embarrassment, raised her hand, wanting to ask a question. "Irina, if God does exist, then why is there so much suffering in this world? Why do wars, natural disasters, and diseases occur?" Irina turned to the speaker with a gentle, encouraging smile. "That's a very important question. We often ask ourselves that, but let me pose a counter question. Can we truly appreciate happiness if we have never experienced sadness?" The student fell silent, pondering over her words. Irina continued, "In the Christian faith, this world is considered a test. We may not always immediately grasp God's design, but that does not mean there isn't hidden wisdom behind the trials. Just as a child does not understand why parents forbid them from running by the road, God knows more than we can comprehend." A silence fell over the audience. Many students, previously skeptical, now seemed thoughtful. Professor Victoria took a deep breath, realizing that Irina was indeed skillfully handling her arguments. Her words were not just answers, but a whole philosophy behind her faith. Irina remained calm and composed, but she knew that the discussion was far from over. Nevertheless, Professor Wilson was not about to give up. She crossed her arms and continued, "All right, Irina, let's say the universe does indeed have a designer. But why are you certain that he is the God you believe in? Why can't it be just the laws of nature working on their own?" Irina took a deep breath before answering. "Professor, the laws of nature are part of the orderliness I've already mentioned. They cannot exist without someone who set them. Take the law of gravity, for example. Where did it come from? It's an established order, allowing planets to orbit so precisely. Does this not indicate the presence of a mind that designed and created all this?" The students again began to discuss among themselves what they had just heard. Professor Wilson narrowed her eyes, realizing that the discussion was taking an unexpected turn for her. Despite her accomplishments, Victoria had never encountered such a competent interlocutor. "Irina, you are very good at dialogue, but is your faith based only on logic? Or is there an emotional reason that inspires and gives you so much confidence?" Irina, unflustered, met the professor's gaze with confidence. She realized that this was a decisive moment, a moment for her sincerity and faith to prevail, and she could prove to the professor the value of her conviction. Taking a deep breath, Irina replied, "Professor, My faith is not solely based on logic. I have witnessed manifestations of God in my life. Her voice grew slightly stronger, infused with emotion. I feel His presence in every breath I take, in every prayer, in everything I see and hear. I believe in God, not because I was simply taught to, but because I have found Him through my own trials. A deep silence settled in the auditorium. Even Professor Wilson was impressed by Irina's confidence. Her answers were not merely the result of reasoned thoughts, but an expression of a living, sincere faith. Professor Victoria did not immediately find the words to respond, but when she did, her tone was softer. "Irina, your answers are quite compelling," she acknowledged in a quiet voice. "I want to understand how deep your beliefs are and would like to ask one more question. If the God you believe in is truly omnipotent, why does He not reveal Himself more plainly? Why does His existence often appear so elusive? If He truly exists, why must people search and trust beyond visible facts?" Some students nodded quietly, remotely considering the question they had also asked themselves. Irina did not answer immediately. Her eyes briefly closed, as if she was collecting her thoughts. It seemed she was mentally searching for an answer in a deep source of truth, wishing her words to be both felt and heard. When she opened her eyes, her gaze was filled with light. "Professor," she began, her voice low but confident, "do you believe that love exists?" Professor Victoria slightly furrowed her brow, surprised by the change in topic. Before answering, "Yes, of course, love exists." Irina subtly inclined her head. "And can you show it? Put it on this table and say, 'Here it is'?" Professor Wilson was silent. She started realizing where this conversation was headed. Love is real, and we all feel it through its manifestations. In how someone treats us, in the care and warmth we experience among loved ones. And God is like that love. Perhaps we cannot see Him directly, but His presence is visible everywhere, in the beauty of nature, in the realm of physical laws, in the mind and consciousness of human beings. Her voice grew stronger, resonating with the depth of her conviction. God is also manifested through creation, through the goodness and mercy bestowed upon us, through miracles we might overlook. Professor Wilson was momentarily struck by the notion that reality might be even more complex than she had assumed. It was an unexpected angle on the question of faith that she hadn't anticipated. She realized that her worldview had encountered a sincere assertion capable of shaking the foundations of everything she believed in. "Perhaps," she said after a while, "your comparison to love is quite illustrative. But if God wanted us to know of His existence, wouldn't it be better if He simply revealed Himself to us?" Upon hearing this question, Irina slightly smiled. "Professor, imagine," she began, her voice inspired and spirited, "that a teacher has set a test for their students. Does the teacher immediately provide all the answers before the students even begin to ponder the test themselves?" Professor Wilson thoughtfully nodded, recognizing the unexpected yet utterly accurate analogy. "This world is a test, Professor," Irina quietly said. "If God revealed Himself directly, the essence of faith would disappear. True faith lies in the trial, in the verification through experience, through the heart that seeks truth." Her words led Alex to a state of reflection. The students in the auditorium began to understand that these debates had gone beyond simple logic. There was now something more: sincerity, honesty in faith, and a quest for meaning. One of the students, Michael, known for his skeptical attitude toward religion, raised his hand. He felt it important to ask a question that could potentially restore the clarity he needed. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, "but I would like to ask, if God is just, why is there so much injustice and suffering in the world?" His question resonated with many students who began to wonder about it too. Irina noticed that Michael asked this not just from his intellect, but also from his heart. She turned to him and with a warm smile began, "Michael, have you ever seen an artist paint a picture?" Michael, somewhat puzzled by the surprise of her analogy, answered, "Yes, of course. Sometimes it's hard to understand what the artist intends, especially at the beginning." Irina nodded. "So is life. We only see a fragment of the great picture God is creating. We see only the suffering and injustice that catch our eye. But God sees the entire picture. And everything in this world has its purpose, even if we're not immediately able to understand it." Michael paused, reflecting on the depth of her words. He hadn't expected to receive such a profound answer. Professor Wilson listened intently to her students, observing their reactions. She realized that the discussion was shifting beyond intellectual, becoming something personal and emotional, which evoked respect in her. Victoria's face showed mixed feelings, and she understood that not all arguments were entirely clear. Nevertheless, she was going to use one of her last arguments. "Irina," she said in a half-whisper, but with clear intonation, "your resilience is impressive. But don't you think that religion can be a source of conflict and wars? Many atrocities have been committed in the name of God. How do you plan to defend that which has, at times, brought destruction?" The professor's words brought an end to the silence observed over the past few minutes. Irina calmed herself, recognizing the importance of the matter. She took a deep breath. "Professor, the answer is in the details. A knife in itself is not evil. With it, one can prepare food, but it can also be used to cause harm. Similarly, religion remains just a tool. It is intended to bring peace, compassion, and justice, to reveal what is embodied in its foundations. The problem isn't with religion itself, but in how it is used." Some students began to applaud quietly, recognizing the wisdom of her response. Many felt that her answer was not only logical, but also deeply truthful. Professor Wilson felt respect for Irina's opinion, and there was a fresh honesty in her eyes that assessed her. Victoria took a deep breath, deciding to ask one final question. "Irina, your answers are impressive, but I still want to know if you have something personal that proves the existence of God." The atmosphere in the auditorium became charged again, and everyone turned their gaze to Irina, eagerly awaiting her response. Irina took a deep breath, realizing that this was a moment to speak, not just from reason, but also from the heart. She knew this was an opportunity to change the perception of those around her. In a class that had perhaps previously judged her views, now everyone was tense, waiting for answers that could become pivotal. Irina closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began. "When I was 10 years old, I experienced something that changed my life forever." The students intertwined their fingers, awaiting a story that hung in the air of curiosity. "My mother and I were walking home, as usual, after school, when a truck lost control and came barreling toward us. At that moment, with only a prayer left, I managed to realize my plea: God, save us. That brief thought went up to the heavens, and we were safe." The students were moved by her story. They understood that this was a moment when nothing else but turning to God could save them. Many would say it was just luck, she continued. But I know it wasn't. It was protection that I felt at the moment when my mother, I, and the driver remained unharmed. Even if it's not logically substantiated, I felt a power coming from the heavens. Professor Wilson looked at Irina with a contemplative expression. She was processing what she had just heard, something she had not known before. Irina continued. It's not just that, she began in a softer tone. We often overlook the miracles surrounding us. When you are at the lowest point in your life, and suddenly you find salvation, when a solution doesn't appear, and through prayer comes not just an answer, but peace. Isn't that an embodiment of an ancient request? The class was quiet. The students realized that faith was not only a matter of intellect, but also of emotions, and their hearts were touched by her story. Professor Victoria, despite having her own doubts, was impressed by Irina's spiritual resilience. She smiled slightly and turned back to the audience, realizing that Irina had influenced not just her, but everyone present. Irina, your words are deeply persuasive, she said, her eyes shining with understanding. You've opened a new perspective, and your journey and faith allow for a rethinking of many things. Irina appreciated the support. She concluded, I'm not asking you to accept faith right away, Professor. Faith is a journey, not an obligation. But I hope you'll enjoy traveling with an open heart. The auditorium had completely transformed due to the discussion. Students stood up, some applauded, while others, seemingly under the influence of a new perspective, found tranquility in acceptance. This was not just a debate, it was a sincere conversation about important matters. Victoria, aware of the differences in their positions, felt something greater, a sense of respect and gratitude for the opportunity for reflection. She allowed her heart to open to new questions about faith, compassion, and the meaning of existence. As she exited the auditorium, Victoria Wilson realized that her view of the world had slightly changed. She could not know what role this lecture would play in her life, but she felt a shift. Only moments like these can awaken in us the desire to seek something greater. Each of our journeys begins in its own way, and sometimes one only needs to look at the world with a different, silent, and deeply breathing heart. This lesson would become part of their lives, because only through understanding do we become richer and closer to the truth. This day remained memorable not only for the students, but also for the professors who witnessed the strength and power of faith. Their hearts now sought something more meaningful than mere logic and theories. And perhaps, for the first time in her life, Victoria asked herself a question that had previously seemed unnecessary. What if there is something greater? And in her heart, as in the hearts of the students, a journey was to begin soon, in search of truth.